the siege ended much quicker than expected. The reinforced outer walls of Goldsickle City had been blown apart, and under Axe's command, the first army slowly entered the city. Soon, all the surviving nobles were brought before Axe. Before he could speak, one of them stepped forward and asked if they could see His Majesty Roland. Axe informed them that the king was too busy to handle matters in the eastern region and that he had full authority here. The nobles were visibly surprised. After all, Axe didn't look like a Greycastle native. Murmurs of doubt spread through the crowd. They couldn't believe Roland would entrust a man of the Sand People to lead an entire army. Shouldn't he be worried the soldiers would disperse? Axe didn't care what they thought. He wanted to know where the Duke was. It didn't take long for him to realize that the two people who had charged at them earlier were the Duke and his companion. Axe ordered the first army soldiers to lock them up and throw them in the dungeon. As they were being dragged away, the nobles immediately protested, shouting that Axe had no right to do this and demanding to see King Roland. Axe paid no attention to the noisy nobles. As night fell, many buildings outside started to catch fire. His right-hand man burst into Axe's tent, panicked, and shouted that the castle dungeon was on fire. Axe, seemingly unsurprised, didn't stop writing and simply asked if there was anything else. His right-hand man hesitated for a moment before quietly asking if Axe was behind it. Axe gave a light nod and said that he had given the order. However, the official report would only blame a group of rats who hated the nobles and had sneaked in through a secret passage to start the fire. His right-hand man was speechless for a second. He couldn't understand, hadn't the nobles already surrendered? Axe put down his quill and looked up. He explained that he didn't have the time to discern whether the nobles were genuinely surrendering, and His Majesty Roland didn't have time to put them on trial. This was why Roland had entrusted him with full authority over all eastern matters before the army set out. He wanted to say more but was cut off by Axe, who handed him a document found in the castle's study. It was a residence census. According to the data, 5 years ago, Goldsickle City and its surrounding areas had a population of around 220,000, making it the most prosperous region in the east. However, this number had plummeted to about 60,000 earlier this year. The Duke had been preparing for war, using all the resources to reinforce the walls, craft weapons, break up the roads, and flood the farmlands, doing everything he could to prevent the First Army from advancing. The once thriving city known for trade had disappeared, and the reduction in farmland led to a massive drop in population. Many starved to death, and more were forced to leave their homes. Without the help of the nobles, how could the Duke have accomplished all this? Meanwhile, in a dimly lit basement, the chaos Bell had expected never came to Goldsickle City. The situation had unfolded in a way he never imagined. Roland's army didn't enter the city to loot and kill. Instead, they immediately began restoring peace. Food from the castle storerooms was distributed to the starving residents, and order was quickly restored. Under the flickering candlelight, Bell realized he had to do something. He took out his record book and tore out the last few pages, which contained recent events, including the Duke's final words. Without hesitation, he burned them. Remembering the Duke's last command to record everything truthfully no matter the outcome, he picked up his quill to fulfill his duty as a scribe. Bell knew that true objectivity didn't exist, especially when recording history, where a bit of bias was to be expected. Taking a deep breath, he began to write. The great King Roland Wimbledon's envoy arrived today in his loyal city of Goldsickle. Damn, this dude is smart, he knows what's up. Meanwhile, back with Roland, Nightingale emerged from the mist, holding a gray falcon. The poor bird was burdened with over a dozen secret letters, looking pitiful enough to bring tears to anyone's eyes. Roland couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for the little creature. So many letters, can they even be called secret? Roland wondered as he began reading. The letters reported that the Eastern Front had easily conquered Goldsickle City and that the mortars had shown great effectiveness in battle. Suddenly, Roland paused, causing Nightingale, who was nibbling on a dried fish, to ask what was wrong. He then told her that Axe had mentioned in his letter that he had set the dungeon on fire. This unexpected action surprised Roland. Though it wasn't a direct order from him, the fire had proven quite effective. It terrified the noble families, causing them to flee the region. Looking at the map, Roland realized that at this pace, Sewan County and other territories would be fully controlled within a month. Knowing he had to quicken his own pace, he focused on their next target, Silverlight City. As before, the massive army sailed down the river into the territory of Silverlight City. Count William invited Roland to a banquet, where he publicly announced his willingness to relinquish his rights and fully support Roland's new policies. The hall erupted in applause. Among them were many merchants. William then mentioned that the machine everyone was curious about in the mine was actually Roland's invention. The nobles and merchants seemed unconcerned about anything else, they were more interested in how these magnificent machines worked. They quickly swarmed around Roland, asking questions about the machine's operation, if he was willing to sell more rail systems, and if they could purchase more steam engines. Roland couldn't help but find the situation amusing. If all of Grey Castle were like Silverlight City, the world would be a much better place. After satisfying everyone's curiosity, Roland and William stepped out onto the balcony. Nightingale stood beside Roland in the mist, listening as he asked William if he knew anything about the Guyland family. William thought for a moment, vaguely recalling the name. He mentioned that the last Guyland had changed their surname about 2 years ago, and their territory now belonged to the Somi family. Nightingale suddenly grabbed Roland's arm. Roland continued to ask about the name change. However, William wasn't sure either, suggesting that the last Guyland might have found it easier to join another family. He pointed to the hall, offering to bring someone from the Somi family if Roland wanted more information. Roland waved it off, saying he was just asking out of curiosity. Back at the camp, as soon as Roland closed the tent flap, Nightingale hurried to explain that she had cut all ties with the Guyland family long ago and hoped Roland believed her. Before she could continue, Roland interrupted, placing a hand on her shoulder and earnestly telling her not to worry, assuring her that he trusted her. Nightingale blushed, her gaze shifting away, knowing he was telling the truth. She then explained that she was just surprised because the Somi family had been very close to her father. She wondered why they would let the only heir of the Guyland family change their surname. Roland understood what she meant. The fact that the Somi family hadn't helped Nightingale's little brother to restore his family's estate is very uncommon among nobles with great relationship. Something must have been off. If you find it suspicious, go ahead and investigate, Roland said with a smile. He sat down and told Nightingale that with Sylvie and the Takira witches protecting him, he was absolutely safe in the camp. She didn't need to stay by his side all the time. Nightingale hesitated, saying that the affairs of the Guyland family no longer concerned her. But Roland smiled at her and told her that it was her father's land. She couldn't say it had nothing to do with her. Besides, it's where she grew up. Consider this a chance to revisit old memories. Nightingale looked down, fell silent for a moment, then looked up and made Roland promise to call her back if he needed to leave the camp. Before leaving, she added that she was just going to take a look and wouldn't do anything more. Roland chuckled, feeling a bit helpless. Now it felt as if he were forcing her to go, but he knew that some past events were better faced openly rather than kept inside. Only by confronting them could she truly let go. Not long after, Nightingale returned to the place she once called home. She expected it to be in ruins, but the place had changed significantly. It was now newly renovated and had expanded several times its original size. A crowd had gathered in front of the residence, each person holding a bowl of hot porridge. Following their gazes, she saw a young man smiling and responding to them. He was well-dressed, blonde, and handsome. This was her little brother, Hyde Guyland. She had come only to see her childhood home and didn't plan to reunite with her brother. Just as she was about to wander elsewhere, she sensed something was off. Stopping in her tracks, she looked again and noticed that her brother wasn't wearing a stone of God's punishment, while the guards around him were. This raised a question. Why would a Viscount's heir not wear a stone of God's punishment? Listening closely, the two guards' whispered conversation caught her attention. One remarked on how weird nobles could be, saying Hyde acted obediently in front of their master like a lapdog but changed completely when he was out of sight. The other warned him to stop talking nonsense, reminding him that the Viscount was inside and that getting caught gossiping would cost him his month's pay. Moving through the mist, Nightingale ignored the guards at the door and phased through the walls into the castle. In the study, she found not only Viscount Somi but also two others. An elder advised Somi that he shouldn't have lashed out at Hyde yesterday, while Hyde had submitted to him. Treating him kindly would make him play his role better. Somi angrily pounded the table, admitting he understood but couldn't control himself. He had spent over a decade reaching this position, and just when he was about to claim the two eastern territories, Roland was now here to take everything away. His fury only grew when he thought about William's attitude, who had led the charge in surrendering enfeoffment rights. The elder stroked his beard and smiled, saying that the new king had only reclaimed the enfeoffment rights and that Somi could follow Count William's example by managing the business on his territory, thus minimizing any losses. However, Somi felt that without jurisdiction, the greedy patrols would eventually find their way there, and he'd have no excuse to stop them. But it was what he said next that made Nightingale frown. Somi confessed that if the authorities ever discovered what he was selling, he would end up on the gallows. A drop of cold sweat slid down the elder's forehead as he remained silent for a moment. He then suggested that Somi should immediately abandon that line of business. He had mentioned before that it wasn't a sustainable strategy. Now that Somi had enough capital and the church's restraint was gone, he should focus on legitimate businesses. Hearing this, Somi hesitated for a long time, but he knew this was the only option. After all, he had already seized the Guyland lands. With a cruel smirk, he remarked that the Gailan family never knew what they missed. With them all gone, he could now keep everything for himself. He laughed, adding that Hyde probably still believed his parents had died in a refugee riot. This revelation made Nightingale's expression change. Could there be more to her parents' deaths? Her mind flashed back to her memories. Many years ago, during a riot, her parents had patted her head before they left, telling her they'd be back soon. She waited at home until nightfall, but they never returned. When the door finally opened, she thought it was them, but it was old Gailan who hugged her and told her that her parents were gone forever. Using a communication seal, Nightingale relayed what she heard to Roland, explaining her plan to stay at Somi's residence until nightfall to question Hyde directly. Maybe he knew something. She then started to apologize, but Roland interrupted her, telling her there was no need to apologize. He assured her he would stay in the camp until she completed her investigation and urged her to stay safe and talk to him every 2 hours. A warm feeling surged in Nightingale's heart, and she smiled, saying she understood. During the night, while the guards outside yawned, Hyde, who was asleep, suddenly jolted up. Before he could fully gather his senses, a cold, gleaming dagger was already pressed against his throat. Nightingale appeared behind him, warning him that any scream, call for help, or cry would mean death. She asked if he understood. Hyde nodded. Nightingale then instructed him to turn around and see who she was. As he slowly turned, he first whispered Veronica, then corrected himself and called her sister. Before he could ask any questions, Nightingale demanded to know how he had ended up with Viscount Somi. Hyde quickly explained that after old Gailan's death, the family frequently quarreled. He wasn't sure what had happened, but by the time he inherited the title, there were no savings left. At that point, Somi approached him, and he had no other choice. Nightingale felt a pang of disappointment, sensing that Hyde was lying. She didn't call him out on it, instead asking if he had been forced to merge with the Somi family. Hyde nodded, claiming that if he hadn't agreed, Somi would have killed him, but this was another lie. Nightingale continued, asking what he was doing for Somi now, providing relief for the poor. Hyde shook his head and said Somi was using him as a front to sell dream water. The rats mixed in with the crowd were actually the ones transporting the goods, and he had only recently discovered Somi's deceit. However, the latter part of his statement was a lie. Nightingale didn't call him out and instead asked what his plans were next. Hyde suddenly fell to his knees, tearfully begging his sister to help him. He admitted his past mistakes but pleaded with her, reminding her that he was still her brother. Hyde believed that Somi never regarded him as a true noble and that staying here would only get him killed. Nightingale glanced at him and asked if he wanted her to take him away. Hyde hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. He felt that leaving would mean losing everything. Instead, he wanted Nightingale to kill Somi. Only with Somi dead could Hyde become a true noble. He even suggested that Nightingale should kill all of Somi's heirs so that the territory and all his assets would be theirs. Nightingale stared into his eyes, her disappointment palpable. Hyde fell silent. After a moment, Nightingale told him she had one more question. She asked why he had betrayed her years ago. Hyde lowered his head and admitted it was because she was a witch. He rambled on, saying that back then, he was ignorant and didn't realize everything was all fabricated slander by the church. Now, he deeply regretted his actions and hoped for her forgiveness. This time, Hyde wasn't lying. For him and many others, betraying a witch seemed natural at the time, and it was an obvious choice. But one person was different. As Hyde continued to talk, her mind drifted to another person. She remembered the first time she met Roland, who chose to trust her even knowing she was a witch. He harbored no fear or hatred towards witches. This thought brought a smile to her face. She realized she was no longer alone, she had someone she could trust deeply, and who trusted her in return. She slipped into the mist again. Hyde asked where she was going. Nightingale looked back at him and said she was going to do what needed to be done. Moving through the mist, she passed through several walls until she reached Somi's study. She quickly found a hidden mechanism leading to a secret compartment. Inside, she discovered ledgers detailing the transactions of dream water, including quantities and recipients. With these records and the dream water still stored in the mansion, the evidence was indisputable. Next scene, we see Nightingale standing before a gravestone, the final resting place of her parents. She held Somi's confession, in which he had revealed everything. 10 years ago, a commoner found gold in the river while fetching water and immediately reported it to Somi. They investigated and found that the gold deposit was likely beneath the Gailan family's territory. Driven by greed, Somi hired the rats to take advantage of the refugee riot to kill Nightingale's parents. Somi then approached old Gailan, offering to make him a true noble in return for his cooperation. Old Gailan quickly took in young Hyde and little Nightingale, managing the land in their stead but deceiving them about their parents' deaths. The plan was to force Hyde to relinquish the land and title when he came of age, but Nightingale's awakening as a witch disrupted this plan. After she killed old Guylan and disappeared, Somi had no choice but to find Hyde to change his plan. Thinking about the irony behind all this, Nightingale couldn't help but smile bitterly. The land that should have rightfully belonged to Hyde had become a bargaining chip, while Hyde naively believed that Somi was helping him. Standing before her parents' grave, Nightingale lit the confession document. Perhaps her parents could see this in the heavens. As night fell, Hyde was already locked up. He learned that Somi had been sentenced to the gallows and that the rest of his family members would be subjected to 20 years of hard labor, and their territory will then revert to Grey Castle. Hyde angrily shook the bars of his cell, unable to believe this was the outcome. Nightingale told him he should be grateful he wasn't considered part of the Somi family, at least he was still alive. Hyde shouted furiously, accusing Nightingale that she never forgave him and calling her a liar. He collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down his face. He knew Nightingale hadn't forgiven him, and now he had lost everything, without a title, land, or anything else. What else could he do? Nightingale told Hyde he was right, she hadn't forgiven him and she never would. The closer the bond, the more unforgivable the betrayal. But Hyde was wrong about one thing, at least she had given him freedom. Neither old Guylan nor Somi could control him anymore. His future was his own to decide, no longer a puppet to be manipulated. Leaving the dungeon, Nightingale told him that whether he saw this as punishment, torture, or simply wanted to hate her, it didn't matter. These were all his own choices. After this, they would no longer have any connection. With those words, she walked away, leaving Hyde to his fate. Leaving the dungeon, Nightingale found Roland waiting for her not far away. With a smile, Roland asked, "Letting that guy go unharmed, is that really okay? I've been wanting to teach him a lesson for a while now." Nightingale smiled back and playfully asked, "And in what capacity would you do that?" Roland choked on his words and then told her, "Naturally, in my capacity as king." Suddenly, Nightingale stopped, knelt on one knee, and with a serious expression, asked, "Will you allow me to serve by your side in the future?" It was as if they had returned to the night of Nightingale's pledge. Roland's face became slightly red as he wasn't expecting this, so he asked why she brought this up so suddenly. Nightingale blushed as well, admitting she just wanted to hear Roland say it again. Roland smiled, patting her head, and said, "Of course, as many times as you need to hear it. 100 times, if that's what it takes. Is that enough for you?" Nightingale's face lit up with a smile, "As you wish, Your Majesty." In her heart, she thought to herself, "Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Ah, this is too cute." Soon, Roland led his army into the old royal capital. Everyone eagerly awaited his arrival, with children even climbing onto rooftops to catch a glimpse of the king. After a year, Roland stepped onto this place once again. He and Anna stood on the carriage, waving to the crowd. The first army soldiers maintained a vigilant guard around them. A girl saw Roland waving in her direction and excitedly told her friend that the king was waving at them. Her friend, a bit more skeptical, remarked that he was waving at everyone in that direction. The first girl insisted they were included in everyone as well. To them, Roland seemed much kinder than the second Prince Timothy. However, a boy reminded them that this seemingly kind king had sent many nobles to the gallows and hanged them, including his own brother Timothy. He added that Roland had also executed many rats in the capital. What he was implying was Roland had the highest kill count of anyone. Hearing this, the girl was annoyed by his constant rambling. Their attention soon shifted to the beautiful woman standing beside Roland. As the carriage moved slowly down the street, a man with a crossbow stood in a nearby tower, aiming the crossbow towards Roland. "But where's the arrow?" Suddenly, a figure darted into the tower, crashing into the man and sending him flying, knocking the crossbow out of his hand. It was our lovely Macy, who glared angrily at the would-be assassin. Soon, the Takira witches rushed over and subdued him. Sylvie, watching from the carriage, had seen him ahead of time and it was she who sent out the warning. Roland opened the carriage door and thanked her. He noted that the old capital still had many remnants of the past regime, indicating that the situation was not as stable as he had hoped. Sylvie smiled and said she was just doing her duty. Agatha, however, was not happy, stating that entering the city under such conditions was way too reckless. She reminded them that Roland was just an ordinary person with a fragile body, and a small injury could be fatal. Anna stepped forward, assuring them she would block any attacks, reminding Agatha that Manhwa was also on the team. Agatha, still stern, argued that they shouldn't coddle Roland all the time. Phyllis and Isabella chuckled nearby. Roland quickly changed the subject, saying that the risk was acceptable to make a grand entrance. As the new king, Roland knew he had to make himself known to the people. Agatha still felt uneasy, suggesting he should address the people from the palace's high platform where he could be better protected. Roland, however, wouldn't admit he simply wanted to experience how it felt patrolling the city. Soon, they arrived at the palace. As they walked through the gates, a group of people stood respectfully waiting for him, many familiar faces among them, all originally from Neverwinter. Roland nodded to them, then descended from the carriage. He lifted his cloak, walked on the red carpet, and said, "Let's go, follow me into the palace." Nobles and officials had already lined up the sides of the palace, awaiting Roland's arrival. As he approached, all of them, including the servants and soldiers, knelt on one knee, shouting, "Hail to His Majesty the King!" Amidst the resounding cheers, Roland ascended the steps. A woman handed him a golden scepter, saying it was the king's staff. Roland accepted it with one hand, surveyed the hall, and slowly spoke, saying that everyone here should already know who he is. And his purpose here is simple: to eliminate threats and restore order. He will establish an administrative system similar to the one in Neverwinter. As many of them have heard, becoming an official in the city hall comes with excellent pay and benefits. Moreover, promotions will be based on ability, not bloodline or family background. In other words, anyone with sufficient capability, even a commoner, could attain high positions such as department minister or chief minister. Upon hearing this, many people's eyes lit up, especially those from less privileged backgrounds. The prospect of advancement based on merit rather than lineage filled them with hope. A few days later, Roland looked out the window, observing the nearly complete restored order and peace after several rounds of screening. He was about to summon Tassa and the others for a discussion when a guard entered with the latest news. "Your Majesty, a messenger from the northern garrison reports that they have spotted the Dawn army to the west of Hermes," the guard said hurriedly. Roland's brow furrowed as he read the secret letter. He then quickly issued orders for the first army to depart from the capital by ship and head to the Northlands at full speed. The guard swiftly left to carry out the command. Roland then picked up his quill, thinking that waiting for the first army to reach Coldwind Ridge would be too late. There was something he needed to do beforehand. Meanwhile, near the old holy city, many troops were stationed outside. They had burned down the surrounding forests and were mercilessly slaughtering the nearby villagers. A man put down his sword, wiped his hands, and listened to the screams around him, saying indifferently, "So noisy." Not far from him, villagers were being impaled on sharp spikes, and few survivors managed to flee, shouting that the Dawn army was about to attack the holy city. An old man, panting heavily, knew that the church was on the brink of collapse and that the towns below Hermes had become hell on earth. Fortunately, they had escaped through a small secret passage, but now he was in the hands of another group of people. The old man was asked if he knew anything about the secret passage that bypassed the holy city and led directly to the base of Hermes. He nodded, saying that there were several exits, but he only knew the one leading toward the Kingdom of Dawn direction. The man questioning him nodded in response and promised him a reward if he guided them. The old man, however, did not want any rewards and only wished to return home. The man smiled, regretting that to ensure no accidents occurred, the old man would need to stay with them for the next few days. The old man wanted to argue, but then he saw the 5 gold coins in the man's hand. The man assured him there would be 5 more after the task. Gulping hard, the old man knew what 10 gold coins could buy in Greencastle and realized he couldn't refuse. Soon, they reached a cliff and entered a cave. It led to a narrow path, barely wide enough for 2 people. The old man remarked that even if they could reach the Kingdom of Dawn, they couldn't defeat the Dawn army in one strike. The man simply told him they were not here to fight alone, His Majesty's reinforcements were on their way. Hearing this, the old man was skeptical but stayed silent. Upon returning to the camp, the old man finally saw the so-called reinforcements. It was a group of young and beautiful girls, many of whom looked quite young, and of course, there was a pigeon too. He was perplexed, wondering what use these girls could be, but soon he noticed the soldiers cheering for them, calling out Lady Lightning and Lady Macy. Then he saw another familiar face, the Duke's daughter, nicknamed the Pearl of the North. What was she doing here? Edith handed a sealed letter to the man, stating that the king had granted her full authority as acting commander. She was to oversee the bomber mission. After reading the letter, the man saluted her and assured her that the northern garrison would fulfill their duties. Edith returned the salute. The entire camp sprang into action. Although the man had no idea what a bomber was, he trusted that anything devised by the king had to be immensely powerful.